on some lines from the Venerable Bede. A new cycle begins. Like spears, the first green shoots pierce the last dry leaves of the previous autumn. We find ourselves in that time of melting snow and bitter wind when a still almost new Christianity, imported from the East through the mediation of Italy, struggles against an immemorial paganism in the regions of the North, spreading like fire through some ancient forest littered with dead wood. It is the stormy dawn of the 7th century. The most astonishing words which have come down to us on the subject of this change from one faith to another, from the gods to a god, are transmitted through the intermediacy of the Venerable Bede, who recorded them more than 100 years later, no doubt in his monastery at Jarrow, where, surrounded by a world in turmoil, he composed in Latin his great history of the Christian foundations of England. They were spoken by a thane of Northumberland, who belonged to the powerful Saxon race, mixed with Celtic blood, which at that time occupied the northern part of the British Isles. The scene takes place on the outskirts of York, where the buildings of ancient Eboracum, the Roman capital where Septimus Severus died, were still in only the first stage of their existence as ruins. Yet they doubtless seemed to the thane and his contemporaries as if out of some timeless antiquity. About 200 years before, the Emperor Arcadius, in a proclamation to the inhabitants of Britain, had announced that the legions were to recross the sea, leaving them to defend themselves against invaders. Since then, they had made shift as best they could. Bede put the thane's words into Latin. Almost a century and a half had to pass before Alfred the Great, and the free time left him from his struggles against Danish invaders, retranslated this text into an English which was still very close to an old Icelandic and various Germanic dialects, but which in the meantime, thanks to the adoption of the Latin alphabet, had acquired the dignity of a written language with a great future before it. If I take the trouble to mention these linguistic vagaries, it is because too few people are aware of the extent to which human speech is relayed to us from the past in stages, staggering along, infected with miscomprehensions, eaten away by omissions, and encrusted with additions, thanks only to someone like Bede, the man of contemplation, or Alfred, the man of action, who endeavored, despite the almost hopelessly chaotic state of the world, to conserve and transmit what seemed to them worth conserving and transmitting. The brief speech of the thane is, as we shall see, surely one such example. Edwin, king of Northumberland, at that time the most powerful prince of the British Heptarchy, had recently received a request from a Christian missionary to evangelize in his lands. He summoned his council. As was fitting, the high priest of the local deities, a certain Kofi, was invited to speak first. The language of this divine was more cynical than theological. "To be frank, Your Highness," he said, in effect, "since I have served our gods and presided over our sacrifices, I have been neither happier nor more fortunate than a man who is not devout, and my prayers have rarely been granted. Therefore, I am in favor of welcoming another god who may be better and stronger, if he can be found." The priest spoke pragmatically. The leader of the clan who followed spoke as a poet and a seer. Asked to give his opinion on the introduction of a god named Jesus into Northumberland, this thane, whose name is unknown to us, broadened, as it were, the discussion. Quote, "The life of man on earth, my lord, in comparison with the vast stretches of time about which we know nothing, seems to me to resemble the flight of a sparrow, who enters through a window in the great hall warmed by a blazing fire, laid in the center of it, where you feast with your counselors and liegemen, while outside the tempests and snows of winter rage. And the bird swiftly sweeps through the great hall and flies out the other side. And after this brief respite, Having come out of the winter, he goes back into it and is lost to your eyes. Such is the brief life of man, of which we know neither what goes before nor what comes after. End of quote. The Thane's conclusion accords with that of the priest. Since we know nothing, why should we not appeal to those who may know? That point of view is characteristic of an open mind. It leads to the acceptance of certain sublime truths or hypotheses, and sometimes to being taken in by trickery or overthrown by error. We don't know the opinions of the other members of the council, but these two voices carried the day. The monk Augustine was authorized to preach Christianity in Edwin's lands. The decision, which would have been taken in any case, even had the king's counselors been opposed to it, since it was very much in the air at that time, was pregnant with consequences that still affect us. It carries within it the island monastery of Lindisfarne, that haven of peace and learning in troubled times until the day when the Vikings sunk their axes into the skulls of the monks. It carries within it York Cathedral in Durham, Ely in Gloucester, St. Thomas of Canterbury, assassinated by the knights of Henry II, and the rich abbeys despoiled by Henry VIII, the Catholicism of Mary Tudor, and the Protestantism of Elizabeth, the martyrs on both sides, the thousands of volumes of sermons and devotions, some admirable mystical writings, the cloud of unknowing, and the revelations of divine love of Juliana of Norwich, the homilies of John Donne, the meditations of John Law and Thomas Traherne. And even as I write these lines, the Catholics and Protestants who are shooting each other in the streets of Belfast. The England of Edwin emerges from its Bronze Age to enter the European community, which at that time was indistinguishable from Christianity. After the arrival and departure of the Roman legions and the invasion of the monks from Rome, with all the gains and losses in both cases, a new order once more replaces the old. Until that moment when this new order will itself be replaced. No doubt many of us have wondered how such a changing of the gods was achieved, what doubts and anguished torments preceded it or were born of it, what outbursts of the spirit it occasioned. In the episode described by the Venerable Bede, at least, we observe the grossest cynicism operating undisguisedly on one of the participants, spiced perhaps with a certain love of novelty for its own sake. Such a frame of mind is not exclusive to today, and most assuredly with a lively taste for the material goods the new god might bring with him. In the other speaker, whose poetic style is more pleasing to us, there is a deep skepticism which seems to show some profound thought, yet he unhesitatingly trusts the opinions of some newcomer who claims to possess true knowledge. To be sure, one cannot generalize from this one example. This is, in any case, what one pious chronicler tells us about the conversion of King Edwin and his liegemen. That absence of reflection which almost always presides over human affairs appears not to have been lacking on this occasion as well. If the far-reaching effects of this decision were great, its immediate results were uncertain. The high priest Kofi, example par excellence of the zealous turncoat, rushed to the temple in which he officiated and destroyed its idols, thus depriving the museums of the future of some of those barely articulated statues where the stone itself rises, as it were, to the surface and obliterates the awkward human form, as if whatever god depicted there belonged more to the sacred world of minerals than to that of men. Less than 3 years later, Edwin the convert was killed on the field of battle by a pagan prince. Possibly his ex-high priest and his melancholy thane were killed with him. I don't mean to suggest that had they been faithful to their former gods, they would have been saved. I would rather believe that the powers on high meant thereby to signify that whoever embraces a faith out of hope for material gain, rather than the spiritual gain it may bring, is deceived. At our great distance from them, we cannot know whether or not those spiritual goods were bestowed on Edwin and his liegemen. But let us leave there the historical background and the effects of that memorable occasion. Let us look once more at those few phrases of the Thane and see what they may still tell us. The metaphor drawn from everyday experience seems to contain within it all the violence and rude comfort of northern winters. Also, and above all, the Thane's confession of ignorance remains ours. Or rather, would remain so if the philosophies, the techniques, and all the structures man creates, and of which he is the prisoner, did not hide from the great majority of people today the fact that they know no more about life and death than this leader of a more or less barbaric clan. Bede's Latin prose, awkward though it is yet still too classical for this primitive thought, which is both concrete and vague, more at home in the rough version of Alfred. But for all that, we must take care not to fall into the cliché, which would set this mental world, which looks forward across 1,000 years to the somber, poetic universe of Shakespeare's Macbeth, in opposition to the Greco-Latin spirit, which is assumed to be more logical and less lost in the fog of mystery. It is a matter of epoch. A hero out of Homer or an Etruscan Lucumo might have spoken the same way. Looking more closely at this text, which attracts us initially by its beauty alone, we perceive that the Thane's thought boldly opposes certain age-old habits of mind which persist even today. Those who, like Vinny, see life as a luminous interval between two infinite periods of darkness readily depict those two shadowy zones of before and after as inert and undifferentiated, a kind of frontier of nothingness. For Christians, despite their belief in a blessed or infernal immortality, what will follow after death, they pay little attention to what came before life, is perceived above all as eternal rest. In video, quia quiescent, said Luther as he contemplated tombs. For this barbarian, in contrast, the bird issues from a storm and returns into a tempest. These lashings of rain and this wind-tossed snow and the druidic night make one think of the whirling of atoms or of the whirlwinds of forms in the Hindu sutras. Between these two horrendous storms, the Thane interprets the flight of the bird across the hall as a moment of respite. That is quite surprising. Edwin's Thane knew perfectly well that a bird which has flown into a house of men darts about madly, running the risk of dashing itself against those incomprehensible walls, of burning itself in the fire, or of being snapped up by the hounds lying next to the hearth. Life as we know it is hardly a moment of respite. Yet the image of the bird come out of nowhere and gone back into nowhere is a fine symbol for man's brief and inexplicable passage on earth. One might even go further and make another equally poignant symbol of the hall besieged by snow and wind, lit up for a brief moment in the depths of the mournful grayness of winter. A symbol for the brain, that lighted chamber, that generating fire, placed for each of us temporarily at the center of things, without which neither the bird nor the storm would be either imagined or perceived. 1976.